Good evening. The opinions and statements voiced by our guests do not necessarily reflect the opinions of this network. Enjoy the shows.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio. Broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Thursday nights for the Full Spectrum Project. I am joined with my co-host.
How are y'all doing? I'm Pete Haviland, and we thank you for coming in and listening to us this evening.
And we are also joined for our Weird World News segment by Angie Mole. Say hello, Angie. Angie?
It's that telepathy thing that she's been working on.
It must be. Okay, well, anyway, like I said, this is our first switch to Thursday nights, so we're just a slight bit disorganized, but I promise we will get better. Tonight we are joined by Miriam C. Davis, and she is the author of the X-Man. She's an expert on the New Orleans accident, and we are just thrilled to have her. This is an old case that I think all three of us were just fascinated with, and it was, to me, one of the most bizarre serial killing within the United States. So thank you for joining us, Miriam. We really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's get started right away, if you don't mind. One of the questions that I had was, when the news of the murder of the, I believe it's pronounced Maggio, hit the papers, what was the initial thought of the citizens of New Orleans with just that first single act of murder?
Well, you've got to realize that there had been a similar attack a few months earlier. Not a fatality, but a similar attack.
Okay.
So the Maggio murder was so ghastly and so bloody that I think it just stunned people in New Orleans, because the Maggios didn't have any known enemies. They were well liked, and it was just such an unusual kind of killing that I think stunned would be the first reaction.
And at that time, nobody was thinking that it was, say, a series of murders that were all interconnected. Is that correct?
Well, there was, I think, some talk, and it's hard to be sure, but there seems to have been some memory that there had been some similar attacks a few years before. But it's not clear, there was a different chief of police in 1918 than there had been in the previous murder in 1911. So I think that for that reason, the connection may not have been made so closely. But there was some mention in the press that, yes, some people remembered there had been a similar murder earlier.
So with the similar murder, you're speaking about, I believe that the man's name was Joseph Davy, and that was in 1911.
Davy?
Yeah.
Yeah. He had... So go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you, what the similarities and differences were with it for that whole thing.
Well, with Joe Davy, he was killed with what looked to be a butcher's cleaver, whereas the Maggios were, Joseph Maggio was hit in the head with an axe and his throat cut, and his wife had her throat cut. So there was that difference. And Mary Davy was not badly injured in that attack, but I talked to a profiler and a homicide detective about the attacks in 1910, 1911, and then the series of attacks that started in late 1917. And I said, was there any possibility that there were two different attackers? You had one attacker early on who attacked with a meat cleaver, and then an attacker later on who attacked with an axe. Could it possibly be two different attackers? And they didn't think so. They thought it's extremely unusual to be attacking in that specific way with the instrument that made that kind of injury, attacking the same demographic. So they were pretty agreed that it was almost certainly the same attacker. So I think there has just been a change in the implement that he's using.
Well, now,
and I think there's a good reason.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I can think of a good reason that he would have switched from a cleaver to an axe.
And what would that be?
Is what he was doing in 1910 and 1911. I mean, there were 2 previous attacks on 2 previous couples before he kills Joe Davy. It's like he's building up to it. And in each case, what he's doing is he's stealing a butcher's cleaver and then abandoning it at the scene.
Okay.
Because he can't be walking through the streets of New Orleans at 3 a.m. with a bloody meat cleaver. I mean, even in New Orleans, that's going to call attention to yourself.
Yeah. To say the least.
Not by much, considering what New Orleans does now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but still, when they're looking for somebody with a bloody cleaver, that's kind of a giveaway.
Yeah.
But he needs something that makes a similar kind of wound.
Okay.
Well, he knows that at that time, everybody is going to have an axe in their backyard because everybody has to chop wood for the wood-burning stoves.
Right.
So he can just show up at every scene and know there's going to be an axe for him to use, and he doesn't have to worry about taking it away with him.
Right. And then
so
also
it removes the risk of having to go out and steal a new implement and then abandon at the scene every time.
Right. Now, if I remember correctly, didn't he slash the Maggio's throats with Joe Maggio's brother's straight razor? And I guess that was his brother Andrew, if I remember correctly. Wasn't he a barber? So did he know he was a barber and knew that the straight razor would be in there? Or did he just figure that at the time most men were going to have a straight razor?
No. He brought his own razor. I mean, there's no evidence that it was actually Andrew Maggio's razor. There was early on a suspicion that it was because he was a barber and they were looking at him.
Okay.
But there's no reason to think it was his. I mean, there's no reason to think it's actually Andrew Maggio's straight razor.
Well, didn't they find the straight razor out on the sidewalk near the axe?
Well, they did find one in the bushes. But, what he seemed to have done was abandon straight razor. And, Andrew Maggio, as a barber, had a whole collection of straight razors, and they wouldn't have been able to tell, if it had been one of his or not. Lots of people in New Orleans at that time had very similar razors. But they looked at him very carefully, and they were very suspicious of him simply because he was a barber.
Well, now, didn't I'm sorry, Pete. Go ahead. I keep cutting you off. My apologies.
No, that's fine. I was curious. Do you know if Jake and Andrew, even after release, because of the lack of evidence, were still shunned by the community? And if so, is that when the second murder took place?
Well, we don't really know how they were treated by the community because the newspapers don't really talk about it. I mean, I think over time, a lot of people became convinced that there was somebody targeting the Italian community. And so over time, probably a lot of people became convinced that neither brother had anything to do with it. That's my feeling, but I don't know for certain.
Well, let me ask you this before we start getting really deeper into this. Is that what brought you to wanting to write about the Axeman, and what are your thoughts while you were writing this?
Well, what happened was one day my brother came to visit, and it just happened that he was working on that he was reading John Douglas's book about profiling. Hold on one second. Yeah, he was reading John Douglas's. Founded the FBI lab at Quantico dealing with, profiling center. Okay. So he's reading this book, and we just happened to start talking about serial killers.
Okay.
And we're sitting on the front porch, just sort of shooting the breeze about serial killers. And he tells me, my brother tells me, a story that he read about when he was like in the 7th grade.
Okay.
About this guy in New Orleans who went around whacking Italian grocers.
Okay.
And I just got kind of curious because at the time my husband and I went to New Orleans about once or twice a year.
Okay.
And so I just started Googling the Axeman in New Orleans.
Okay.
And I realized eventually, I stumbled upon the fact that most of the versions you find of the Axeman story on the web and in crime anthologies and so forth, that they are based on a version of the story that a man named Robert Tallant, who was a New Orleans writer, in 1952, he publishes a set of stories called Ready to Hang about murders in New Orleans. And one of those is a chapter on the Axeman called The Axeman Wore Wings.
Okay.
And almost anything you can find out there, anything by anybody who hasn't read my book is going to be some sort of regurgitation of Tallant's version.
Okay.
But I discovered some other people had published some questions about Tallant's version, some critiques and all this. Anyway, there's some questions that had arose. The next time my husband and I went to New Orleans, the archives are in the public library, right outside of the French Quarter, like across Canal Street in the business district. So one Saturday afternoon, I walked across the street, and within 2 hours, I discovered an answer to one of these questions that convinced me that nobody had really researched this story properly, that people had published things on the Axeman who hadn't done the first bit of research on the story. So that's when I knew that there was a book to be written there.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that answers it perfectly. Do you think when you started first reading about the different stories, you think they were trying to cover it as more of a like urban legend without having covered a lot of the information that you found?
Well, actually, I think in some cases what was happening is they were just trying to write a book and they didn't have time to go to New Orleans and do the research.
Gotcha.
And in one case, a writer relied on an email that was sent to them by somebody who claimed to be an Axeman researcher. In another case, it was just pure speculation. So, I mean, look, having published a book now, I know how hard it is to make a living as a writer. And writers who make a living doing this have to churn out things pretty regularly. And I think that can lead them in some cases to taking shortcuts. And I was in the very enviable position of being able to take the time to research it really thoroughly.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. I'm sorry, Brian.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say we have to take a quick break for station identification, but we'll be back with you in just a minute.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, come on. I'm Southern, but... Nope. That'll do. Hello. I am Kat Hobson, host of Paranormal Experience here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. I enjoy having guests from all areas of the paranormal, from ghosts to ufology to cryptids and beyond. You'll find some of the best researchers in their fields bringing you some great information. Join me on Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 p. Eastern here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk radio.
Listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experienced Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Since 1948, Fate Magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting. You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
The time is 23 minutes after the hour.
Hi, everybody. We're back after our station break, and we are speaking today with Miriam C. Davis, who is an expert on the Axeman murders. So, Miriam, just out of curiosity, when did you first decide that you wanted to write about, and do research into true crime and murder and things like that? Or did it actually start with your desire to delve into the Axeman murders?
Well, it had never occurred to me before to write on true crime at all. I mean, my PhD was in medieval history, and my first book was a biography of one of the most important women archaeologists of the 20th century, the woman who excavated biblical Jericho.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
I was I'm all over the place, but I had been kind of interested in serial killers since, I guess, in graduate school. I read Anne Rule's book about Ted Bundy.
Okay.
And I was just kind of fascinated with the idea of somebody who appeared to be so normal, and then had this completely different life. And I mean, just the dichotomy of that just fascinated me. And since then, of course, I learned a lot about serial killers, and I learned that, Ted Bundy wasn't as normal as he seemed. I mean, if you'd known him, you'd have known some things were off about him, probably. Right. He was a thief, he was a liar, that kind of thing. But that's what initially attracted me. And so when my brother started talking, I saw my brother apparently was afraid I'd see this book by John Douglas. I can't remember the title of it, but it came out about 2000. And he was afraid that I would think that he was very weird for reading this book. And so I saw the book and I said, oh, yes. And he was surprised that I was interested in serial killers. And that's how we got on this whole conversation. But then what happened is I was working on my first book. I had plenty of work to do, and I was, I'd sit in my office waiting for students to come by who never did, and I just procrastinate. I mean, there was plenty of work I could have done. But I just Googled the Axeman of New Orleans basically as a way to procrastinate. But then I started following these little links until I discovered Robert Tallant's book.
Okay.
And then I discovered these various. One of the interesting things that happened is that, as I said, even though even people who questioned aspects of Tallant's version still used his paradigm. And in Ready to Hang, in Tallant's book, Tallant says the New Orleans police investigating the Axeman murders remembered that there had been a previous series of attacks in 1911 of three other Italian grocers named Cruti, Rossetti, and Sciambra, and that they and their wives had been attacked, and some of them had died as a result. Well, the crime writer Michael Newton said in one of his books that, in fact, there were no unsolved axe murders in New Orleans in 1911, and no one by the name of Cruti, Rossetti, and Sciambra had been murdered that year. So when I went into the New Orleans archives, the first time I was researching it, that's what I did. I went to the coroner's records for 1911, and I looked through to confirm that there was nobody by the name of Cruti, Rossetti, or Sciambra, and there wasn't. But
I'm actually impressed that you had records going back to 1911.
Oh yeah, there are coroner's reports, there are homicide reports, there are arrest reports. There's a lot of turned out to be a lot of good stuff. But one of the things I was actually able to discover is the Joseph Davy killing.
Okay.
Which I'd never seen the name Joe Davy. But when you read the description of his murder, it was clearly one of these, attacks that was very similar to the Maggio attack of 1918. So that's when I thought nobody's actually looked through these records to see if there's an Axeman attack in this year. And that's what made me decide that, it hadn't been properly investigated.
Now, just out of curiosity, getting back to the Joe Davy murder, was that reported in the newspapers at the time?
Oh yeah, that's one of my major sources of information. At the time, New Orleans had 3 or sometimes 4 different newspapers.
Okay.
And at the time, newspapermen would publish in much greater detail than they would ever publish today, or that the police would give them information about aspects of crime. So there are a lot of details in the accounts of these crimes. And I'm able to check the various versions in the various newspapers against each other and against the homicide reports. So the newspapers were a big source of my information.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that because it seems to me that with that type of a murder, it would have been something that the newspapers would have, attached itself to. But as I was doing research for the radio show tonight, I kept running across all of these sites that kept saying that murder and the murders in, I believe, 1910 and 1911 were never reported in the newspapers. And I was thinking to myself, well, a murder like that should have been. And I always wondered.
Oh yeah, that's nonsense.
Yeah, it seems to me.
I mean, that's nonsense. Yeah. There were 2 attacks in August and in September of 1910, neither of which was fatal. And then there was a fatal attack on Joe Davy in June of 1911. And they were all covered. I mean, obviously the murder was covered in even greater detail, but they were all covered in all the newspapers.
Go ahead, Pete.
Well, I was going to say, a block away from the house, I guess it was a Maggio house. It was written on the sidewalk in chalk that Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony. Did anyone ever discover the meaning of this cryptic message, and who was Mrs. Tony? And did they determine that this cryptic message was part of the case?
Okay. First of all, we don't know what the message said. There are 3 different versions of the message.
Okay.
If you hold on, I can look in my book and I could read the different versions to you.
Sure.
I have to find it because I haven't got them memorized. The different newspapers had different versions of the message. The Times-Picayune reported it as Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony. The New Orleans States said Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just right, Mrs. Tony. And the New Orleans Item carried a 3rd variation. Mrs. Joseph Maggio will sit up tonight, just right, period, Mrs. Tony. Now, it seemed to me, this is just my opinion, that the Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony, just is the one that makes the most sense, just linguistically.
Right.
Mrs. Tony might have been Mrs. Tony's Sciambra. There was another Italian grocer couple, Johanna and Tony Sciambra, who were murdered in the middle of the night in their groceries in 1912, but they were not. I do not believe they were Axeman victims. They were shot, and she wasn't even shot deliberately. He was clearly the target of the murder, and one of the bullets went through his body and hit her and killed her as well.
Oh, so she was collateral damage.
I think so, yes, and I don't think, and it's funny because I've seen writers who said, for some reason the Axeman elected on this occasion not to use an axe but to use pistol, and it's like, that makes no sense. This is clearly some sort of vendetta killing or some sort of business killing, what some people would call the mafia, even though I'm not really sure there's what we would call a mafia in New Orleans at the time. There was a Mrs. Tony who probably people thought of, right? This was 1918. The killing had been, the Sciambras had been in 1912. People probably remembered that. And maybe somebody was just making a commentary about it. That's the only thing I can figure out that refers to. But we don't actually know for sure what the message said because it was reported, 3 different ways by 3 different newspapers.
What did they ever determine whether it was actually written by the Axeman, or was it?
Oh
just,
no,
they never could figure that out.
That would be hard
No.
that would be hard to determine, I would think, unless
Well,
you
yeah,
had,
but-
had somebody that looking at.
But it does seem like a lot of people have attributed it to him actually writing it as a cryptic whatever. So that's why I was wondering, because it was just like linked to it, and no one really knows whether it technically was or not. That's what I was trying to get at.
right. I mean, it seems to have been written after the murder, or at the time of the murders, with these murders in mind. But I had a guess, which is, this was just somebody's commentary on how the murder of the Maggios reminded them of the murder of the Sciambras. But I don't actually have any reason. I never came across any reason to really think that anyone thought it really had anything to do with the actual killer.
Well,
But we'll never know. I mean, our sources are limited. And so what we can actually know for sure is I try to be humble about this, because, what I can say for sure is limited, and a lot of it is speculation. But I personally don't have any reason to think that it really it was written by the killer at all.
Well, you had brought that up, and all of a sudden, when we were discussing the writing on writing on the sidewalk, it reminded me of the Ripper when they found the writing on the wall on one of his murder sites, and it was kind of really hard to determine if it was written by him or not, as well.
Yeah, that is true, and that's the problem, is that because there were so few, they didn't have much in the way of forensic capability then. That it's hard, they couldn't answer these questions.
Right. Now you had. I want to kind of go back to the Joseph Davy murder. You had mentioned that there were another killing where the victims were shot, and that people were just automatically attributing that to the Axeman killing. I had read that back during the Joseph Davy killing, that a lot of people were theorizing that the killing itself, the Davy killing, might have been done by a mafia group called the Black Hand. Did you run into anything that could substantiate any of that, or was that just something thrown out by the media?
Well, there wasn't a Black Hand group, but there was a type of extortion called Black Hand.
Okay, got it.
What I mean by that is you'd have various groups, who of extortionists, who would write a letter to a grocery owner or to saloon owner and basically say, if you don't pay us money, we're gonna harm you. And what they'd usually do is end up actually blowing up the building. That was the most common way, or burning it down. That's the way that the Black Hand usually operated. And there was some evidence that came out of that Joe Davy had been an attempted victim of one of these extortionists, and he had just ignored the letter. And you never knew if the extortionist was going to follow through with their claim or not, because sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. Okay. But for whatever reason, he just decided to ignore it. And then when he was murdered, you did have that be one of the avenues that the police looked into. So that was perfect. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for them to have looked into at the time. But they never found, and it was pretty routine to send Black Hand extortionists to the penitentiary, because this was a real problem in New Orleans and Chicago and elsewhere where there were large Italian immigrant communities. But they were never able to find any person or persons that they could connect with the attempt to extort the Davies, and so that might be connected with the Davy murder.
Now, did anybody ever look to see if the Axeman did any killings outside of New Orleans, or was it strictly just in the city of New Orleans?
I have found 3 killings that occurred outside New Orleans in 1920 and 1921. that the MOs are almost, well, they're exactly the same as the Axeman. And I am pretty well convinced that after the Axeman left New Orleans in 1919, that he went to, first of all, Alexandria, Louisiana, where in December of 1920, he attacked a couple called Joseph and Rosie Sparrow, in bed with an axe, middle of the night, same thing. Joseph's throat was also slashed with a knife. He was killed, and their little girl who was in bed with them was also killed. But again, that was probably collateral damage. It was clearly Joseph who was the main victim, or the main intended victim. And then a few months later, in January of 1921, in DeRidder, Louisiana, Giovanni Orlando was killed in bed with an axe in the middle of the night, also an Italian grocer. And then in April of 1921, in Lake Charles, Louisiana, Frank Scalisi, also an Italian grocer, also killed in bed in the middle of the night with an axe. So if you look at the details of these cases, and there's less evidence for these simply because they're smaller towns and have fewer newspapers, and I didn't have access to police records in the same way. You know, they didn't exist in the same way, or they didn't continue to exist in the same way. I'm about to put my dog out of the room because he's making he's about to start barking.
Not a problem.
Hold on a second. Could you keep him in here? He's about to start barking. Sorry, I was talking about the attacks outside of New Orleans.
Right.
So the evidence, to me, suggests very strongly that when the Axeman disappears from New Orleans in 1919, that he then reappears starting in 1920 in these other parts of Louisiana. But after that, I can't find any evidence of any similar killings. That does not mean they don't exist. It doesn't exist.
Right.
Because I only stumbled across these other attacks by accident. I mean, it was purely an accident.
Right.
So they could be out there.
Well,
Yeah.
let me...
Pete, hold on a minute. Pete,
Right.
hold on a sec. Unfortunately, we have to take another station identification break, but we'll be back with Miriam C. Davis as soon as we are...
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, come on. I'm Southern, but... Nope. That'll do. Hello. I am Kat Hobson, host of Paranormal Experience here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. I enjoy having guests from all areas of the paranormal, from ghosts to ufology to cryptids and beyond. You'll find some of the best researchers in their fields bringing you some great information. Join me on Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 p. Eastern here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Since 1948, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experienced Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
All right, everybody, we're back, and we are speaking with Miriam C. Davis about the New Orleans Axeman murders. Now, we had a question from the chat room, and it seems that the killer primarily attacked only Italian grocers. Did anybody follow that thread to see if there was somebody with a grudge against the Italians or grocers or both?
Well, I tried to. That is one of the things I tried to solve.
Okay.
Now, this involved going through a lot of the cases that Talent mentioned, because I don't know how familiar your audience is with Talent's version, Robert Talent's version, but he listed a number of attacks that were not on Italian grocers, and the question was it a different set of attacks, or was it a different attacker? What the story was, and what I was able to do is go through all of the accounts carefully, and I was able to establish. I'm pretty certain I was able to establish that there was a pattern, that the ones that were not of Italian grocers were in fact not Axeman killings, that there were enough dissimilarities that there was a good reason to exclude them from the Axeman attacks. So I think I'm pretty confident that I established this pattern, that it was a serial killer who was attacking Italian grocers. Then the question was to try to explain why. And to try to do that, and again, this is just informed speculation on my part, but to try to understand why, you've got to understand about the position of Italians in Louisiana society in 1918. In the later part of the 19th century and early 20th century, Italians had been brought over to work in the Louisiana cane fields and in the cotton fields, and they worked very hard. They were very, very useful, and that's why they, and 80% of the Italians who landed in New Orleans were actually from Sicily. They were Sicilian. So I might switch between saying Sicilian and Italian, but that's important, because Sicilians tend to be sort of darker than like Northern Italians. And remember, the South at that time was very rigidly segregated between white and black.
Right.
And these swarthy Sicilian immigrants didn't fit clearly into either group. They were what historians call liminal. They were kind of borderline. They weren't black, but they weren't considered quite white.
So they're kind of in limbo.
Right. Well, what would happen is they would work. They'd work extremely hard. They're extremely good workers, but they'd save every dime they made, and as soon as they could, they would go into business for themselves.
Okay.
So what's happening is in the early 20th century, Italian grocers are taking over the niche of the corner grocery store. Now, remember, at the time, there's no refrigeration. People have ice boxes. They don't have refrigerators. Housewives have to go shopping basically twice a day. So there's a little grocery on every street corner. I mean, literally just about every street corner. We're talking small groceries, but grocery stores where you can get the basics. At the beginning of the 20th century, Italians owned like 7% of these groceries. By the time we're talking about in 1918, they own almost 20%. No, I'm taking that back. They own close to 50%. So they're very much a rising class, which is, taking over a niche that has belonged to other people. Now we know from eyewitness accounts that the Axeman was white.
Okay.
He wasn't an Italian. He was white, and he was dressed as a working man. So he's working class, and he's white. Now, the other thing that we're pretty sure of is that he was an experienced burglar. That is, the police thought from the very beginning that he was probably a burglar, because he used a railroad tie as a tool to pry open doors, which is a common burglary tool at the time.
Okay.
So one possibility could be that he's a working white who has this class resentment against a rising class that he doesn't see as quite white, right?
Okay.
Maybe he resents the fact that Italians are becoming more and more middle class. Or, and I had a homicide detective suggest this to me, maybe he had been a burglar, and he had an Italian grocer testify against him and send him to prison.
Okay.
So in both of these cases, I'm just sort of speculating. But I'm just trying to come up. It's pretty clear that you have somebody who's white, who's working class, who has this animus against these immigrant Italian grocers. And, I was trying to just come up with some explanation that might make some sense. And that's the kind of the best I could do.
No, it does make sense. It makes perfect.
Yeah, having a grudge against him. You had mentioned the speculation is that he was a burglar. So if I remember correctly, in the Maggio killing, and I actually heard two different versions of this. One that there was a safe that had been opened, everything had been taken out of it, but nothing was actually taken. And even though they said that robbery wasn't a motive, could the Axeman have been trying to throw them off by doing that, or was that just another one of those stories that was put out there that didn't really have a basis in fact?
In some cases, the Axeman appears to have taken whatever cash was lying around handy, but leaving expensive jewelry. In other cases, he just ignored anything he could steal. I mean, it differed from case to case, but it was pretty clear that there had not been in any case there hadn't been a thorough attempt to search the room. I mean, most grocery store owners would have been expected to have a bundle of cash, under the mattress or something. But there were the searches were never, even if some cash or something was taken, the searches were never systematic enough to leave the police to believe that robbery was the primary motive. Now, the exception to this, in my opinion, is the first attack on August Crudy. This would have been in August of 1910.
Okay.
And this is when a grocer named August Crudy was hit in the head with a meat cleaver, and his wife woke up to find this man, waving a meat cleaver in her face and demanding money. And she gave him she gave him $7 to get rid of him. That's the only case, and he walks out of the house, and it's the only case I can tell that there seemed to be that seemed to be a primary motivation. And it's led me to wonder if maybe what happened is the Axeman started as a burglar. For whatever reason, maybe the grocer stirred in his sleep or something, but for whatever reason he clocked the grocer in the head with the cleaver, and he realized that was the thing that he enjoyed doing, that he liked the blood, he liked that sense of control. And from then on, there's never any real evidence of a systematic attempt to burgle the people that he's attacked.
Yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense.
Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, it definitely does, and it I don't know, in my mind, although sometimes people say my mind doesn't work right, but we won't go there. It seems like that would maybe not what you would call a natural progression, but it makes sense that, all of a sudden he found his bloodlust because of something that happened while he was in the act of, stealing something.
Yeah, I do think I think you can see a progression. In the first attack, it's almost like it's accidental. It doesn't seem to be his primary motivation, and Mr. Cruty is not badly injured. The second attack, the next month, the couple, both of them are attacked, and they're both badly, badly injured. They neither of them die, but they are badly injured. It's not until the third attack that somebody's killed, and it's clear that whoever attacked Joe Davy meant to kill him. So you clearly can see this progression.
Well, now, was Joe? Maybe I missed this. If you said it earlier, my apologies. But was Joe Davy an Italian grocer or one of those, or was it? Yes. Did he go? So he was.
Yes.
Okay, I must have missed that earlier. My apologies for that.
No, he and his wife, ran a little grocery just like these others. She was 16. She was pregnant. He was in his 30s. And they were attacked just like the couples in 1910. But as I said, it's the first one where it was clear that the attacker, they called him the Cleaver at the time, that,
Okay.
he fully intended to kill Joe Davy.
All right, so the second confirmed Axeman case was Louis Bessemer, and what turned out, I guess, they originally thought it was his wife, but it was his mistress, Anna Lowe. Do I have that correct?
Well, I would dispute that it was a confirmed Axeman case. I would argue that it was not an Axeman case.
Well, why would that be?
Okay. Well, the next month, somebody discovers early in the morning that you have this grocer, Louis Bessemer, and the woman that everybody thought was his wife, that in fact, as you're right, turned out to be his mistress, Harriet Lowe, that they had been attacked. Now, it makes sense that a month after the Maggio murders, that people would associate, this would be associated in the public mind and in the press with the attack on the Maggios. But it's pretty clear that from very early on, police realized that there were real differences between the attacks. First of all, unlike the other victims, Bessemer and Lowe were not attacked in their beds. It was clear from the evidence, the blood evidence, that Harriet Lowe had been attacked on a back porch and either been dragged or stumbled from the back porch to her bed. Bessemer said he woke up in his bed covered with blood, but the police didn't believe him because there wasn't enough blood in the room for him to have been attacked there. Another thing was that there was no evidence of forced entry anywhere, unlike all the other cases. Also, in all the other cases we know about the Axeman attacks his victims between 1 and 3 in the morning, usually on a moonless night, because it turns out that the Navy keeps records of this kind of thing, and I checked all the Axeman attacks, and they almost all happen on moonless nights, except for the Bessemer attack, where the blood was so fresh when the police got there that they speculated that the attack must have occurred between 6 and 7 in the morning, when it would have been getting light, and neighbors could have seen somebody entering or leaving the grocery, and nobody saw anything. So the police, very early on, do not think this is, by the same person who killed the Maggios. They think, in fact, Bessemer did it. Now, Harriet Lowe is very badly injured. Bessemer is not really. He's got a cut above his eye, but he's not nearly as badly injured as she is.
Miriam?
The police suspect. Sorry?
Can I cut you off here just a sec? This sounds like something we definitely want to hear. But we need to take a top-of-the-hour break, and when we come back, we will definitely continue on with this, because this is one of the murder cases that really kind of had me wondering. So we'll pick this up when we come back and after our Weird World News.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I now introduce to you our Weird World News with Angie Mole. Take it away, Miss Angie.
Good evening, y'all. How are y'all?
I'm fine.
Good. I'm sorry. This has just been a weird evening in general.
It really has.
I have some wonderful news for y'all this week. So 5 years ago, 35-year-old Ricardus Puisis disappeared after leaving work in the UK town of Chatteris. He was believed to have met up with some other men from his home country of Lithuania and wasn't seen again. Police launched a murder investigation. Later, the detectives determined he was a victim of exploitation in a modern-day slavery situation instead and had merely run away, but all attempts to locate him and verify his safety had failed. Then, on July 1st of this year, police went to the woods of a nearby town and found him very well concealed, alive and well in the underbrush, having been intentionally isolated for years.
Wait, by his own family?
Oh, he did leave, and he was living in the woods all by himself.
Wow.
Police didn't announce that he had been located until they had put into place a plan for his protection and necessary support, but he is reported to be doing well and recovering from the ordeal.
Brian must have cooked again.
Well, a lot of people get the runs from my cooking, but they don't run from my cooking, although they probably should. We'll drop that one there.
And in another very similar situation, well, not similar situation, but a similar incident, I guess. 3 men went for a short sail and ended up going missing. They were in a 23-foot boat that left, this should be interesting for me to try to pronounce all these islands, that left Pulawat Atoll in Micronesia and were headed for another one 30 miles away. 3 days later, U.S. and Australian searchers found a big SOS spelled out in the sand of the uninhabited Picolat Island, at which time an Australian helicopter was able to land and give them in food and water while they waited for a Micronesian vessel to come pick them up.
Well, I mean, that's something that you see on a movie, and then spelling stuff out on an island. That's wild.
I know, but isn't it great to know that it works? It's not just Hollywood stuff.
Yeah.
Well, next time I'm stranded, I'll know what to do.
Well, there you go. Apparently it works. They had veered off course and ran out of fuel, and they were 118 miles from where they started out. That's just a little off course.
Just a little, yeah.
Okay, so this one, Dr. Miriam may want to weigh in on also, since she expressed her interest in serial killers at one point. I found this, actually I found it today and thought it was extremely interesting. Jessica Garrison published a new book called The Devil's Harvest. Jose Manuel Martinez was arrested in Alabama in 2014 for murder and extradited to California. They believed he'd killed 9 men over the span of 30 years, but they were wrong. Martinez, who is a charming father and grandfather who is, by all accounts, perfectly normal except for being a contract killer, claims that for 35 years he was hired to take out people who rightfully earned it, like men who hurt women or children or people who stole from drug dealers.
Oh, he was an equalizer.
There is a ton of info you can find about this guy and the case, and I recommend that you do so if it sounds interesting to you. This guy did some out of vengeance and some he was hired for, but it brings up some good discussion about to what extent the police should be responsible for your safety, how some crimes take priority over others for a variety of unfair but valid reasons, and why he got away with it for so long. Because there were many, many, many more than just 9.
Now, see, if he'd have worn a mask, he could have just called himself a Cape Crusader. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you. To try to lift this up a little bit, because it was a little heavy there. A 550-acre drive-through UK animal park in Merseyside has gangsta baboons who are not to be trifled with. People have reported seeing the baboons at Knowsley Safari Park wielding knives, screwdrivers, and even a chainsaw. Who is arming? Can I finish reading this? Your questions shall be answered in time. While the park isn't making official statements, mechanics at nearby shops have said they've been hired to repair damage to vehicles caused by the armed baboons. There are 2 theories about how they got their weapons. The first is that they take them from zookeepers' toolboxes while they're working on things around the park. But how do you just not notice a baboon, number one, close enough to you, and then number 2, close enough to you to steal your chainsaw.
Yeah.
How often do you see a walking around with a carpenter's belt?
Well, like you'd be able to see it under all that hair. And the second theory is that visitors are purposely giving the animals dangerous items to see what will happen.
That could happen. I believe that.
I believe that one more than anything else. And I mean, you think about, people who toss things over the fence into dog parks and, all sorts of other malicious kind of behavior, people tossing things into the playgrounds of, elementary schools or whatever. It totally makes sense. I believe it.
Yeah, but at least when they're tossing the stuff at a dog park, dogs don't have thumbs, so I don't see them walking up to you with a switchblade anytime soon.
No, but they'll eat a poisoned hot dog.
I could believe that they also steal them because I got mugged by a monkey in India. So those little rascals, they are.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have seen video of that happening, and it makes me very angry.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's scary. It's
well, yeah.
scary. Well, they know. They learn it if you have food, and they learn that if they scare the bejesus out of you, you will drop the food and run. And so they've figured out some use for these tools. They can figure out, where to get. I mean, they're smart.
And see, that's actually one of the things that was kind of funny when I was researching this short story, and I looked through a couple of other articles. They said that the primates are already known for being destructive, that they rip off windshield wipers and side mirrors and license plates. And I'm like, wait a second, they learned how to use screwdrivers?
Yeah.
And I mean, I know that they can, that's something that primates will do. But I'm not sure that they mean it in this case. I'm thinking that maybe they're ripping off the license plates, but I couldn't find anywhere that was, I mean, I'm not going to sit still that long if a monkey's monkeying around with my license plate. I'm just going to hit the accelerator.
I actually want to know if I'm the only one that is picturing a baboon holding a chainsaw above his head wearing a leather face mask.
I'm trying not to picture that.
I hate to say that was
there's always a possibility. I'm sorry?
That was the first thing I thought of, to be honest with you. That last scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
I mean, maybe they were going to build their own car one piece at a time.
It may be.
But nobody goes through a drive-through safari park and expects to get carjacked at knife point by the wildlife.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
Not usually, no.
I mean, if they're using screwdrivers and, they're using chainsaws for any purpose, really, I mean, it's only a matter of time before somebody gets kicked out of their own minivan.
Yeah, that's true. Now, thank you. Now I'm picturing a minivan full of baboons.
It's going to happen. Mark my words. We still have several months of 2020 left.
That is true.
Bite your tongue.
That is true.
I mean, I feel a certain way about animal safari drive-through kind of parks to begin with, but I mean, this just kind of proves that when people are bored, bad things happen.
Yeah.
In September, I have facility, so I didn't think about baboons.
That is all I got for y'all tonight, guys. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Angie. I keep wondering what a baboon needs with a chainsaw, but here's something kind of interesting. I found out that I don't actually always need a chainsaw. Something kind of weird happened yesterday.
Don't.
No, seriously, it was really amazing, right? I was out in the back trying to get rid of some dead branches, right? And I was looking at this one branch, and it just kind of cut right in half as I watched. I can cut wood, I'm not kidding. I saw it with my own eyes. It was just really weird.
That was like the biggest letdown ever.
Dr. Davis, I sincerely apologize for the last 30 seconds you had to endure.
That's okay. I've endured worse. I got two brothers.
Give him time. Give him time.
But it was amazing to see. Okay, so let's get back to the subject at hand.
Yeah, shout.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Welcome back to WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. The time is 5 minutes after the hour.
Go ahead,
In case y'all
Pete.
are wondering if that cutoff, we had to purge the last joke that Brian said, so y'all wouldn't have to listen to it again.
What do you mean a joke? It wasn't a joke. It happened. I'm telling you, it happened.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
We've
All right.
talked about this. By definition, jokes have to be funny.
Yes, that's true.
Hey, I'm a legend in my own mind.
Yes, you are, sir.
So there.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So we've been talking to Dr. Miriam C. Davis about the New Orleans Axeman killings. And when we left off, we were talking about what may be the second Axeman case, although Dr. Davis doesn't believe so. It's the case of Louis Bessemer and his mistress, Anna Lowe. And I believe you were just about to tell us why there were some major differences and why you don't believe it was an Axeman killing.
Well, like I said, first of all, there was no forced entry, there has been forced entry in all of the other cases. Secondly, the attack was between 6 and 7 in the morning rather than in the middle of the night. Third is that the couple were not attacked in their bed. They were, Mrs. Lowe was attacked clearly on the back porch, and she stumbled or was dragged to her bed. And even though Bessemer claimed that he just woke up, in bed with blood all over him, the police didn't believe him because they didn't think that there was enough blood to sustain that scenario. Bessemer's hurt, but not badly. Mrs. Lowe is in Charity Hospital, and she keeps coming up with different versions. She tells the police, first of all, that a black man attacked her. Then she tells an account of the attack that makes no sense, couldn't have been possible. And then all the time she's denying that Bessemer did it, when clearly the police think he did. Well, this goes on for several months. She eventually dies several months later of meningitis that was in fact caused by her skull fracture. But just before she dies, on her deathbed, she swears out a statement against Bessemer, accusing him of doing it. And this confirms what the police chief has clearly believed all along. And I think he's right. I mean, I think the evidence, which is limited, and again, I just don't think there's the evidence to sustain that it's the same attacker who attacked all these Italian grocers. And, it looks like the kind of thing that occurred without much forethought. I mean, why would you attack somebody at 6 in the morning when you're going to be discovered an hour later? Why would you sneak into a grocery when it's light and neighbors could see you? He's put on trial. He's tried for murder. And he was acquitted. Now, as I said, I think it was sort of an incident of domestic violence that got out of hand. I think they had an argument that she turned around and hit him with something, and then he turned around and retaliated and overkill, as it were. But yeah. I think legally, there would have been reasonable doubt. I do not think it was unreasonable for the jury to acquit him. First of all, there was somebody, it was clear by the time he goes on trial that there's somebody going around whacking grocers in the middle of the night. Secondly, she clearly, in the time between the attack and her death, she's got some mental issues. She's given so many different versions of what happened that there's good reason, even though I think she's telling the truth before her death, I think there'd be good reason for a jury to think that there was reasonable doubt. But what I'm pretty confident of is that whatever the truth of the Bessemer case, that the evidence does not match the same pattern as you get with all the Italian grocers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Now, you stated that you didn't think that the jury should have acquitted him. Is it true that it only took them 10 minutes once they went into deliberation to come back with a not guilty?
No, I said I thought it was reasonable for the jury to acquit him.
Acquit him.
I think,
okay. I misheard what you said.
Yeah. No. I think he was actually guilty, but legally, I think that not guilty was a reasonable verdict given what they knew. And they did acquit. I don't remember if it was 10 minutes, but it was very quickly. It was less than an hour, I think.
Now, is it true that while he was in jail, that another supposed Axeman murder took place?
Yes.
Yeah, so that would kind of, yeah.
The Romano murder took place in the fall of 1919. And that again, that is an Italian family. It's a mother, her son and daughter, and her two of her grandchildren who lived in the same sort of duplex. The son's name is Joseph Romano, and he is actually a barber, not a grocer. But the mother ran this little Italian grocery in the front of the house. So again, what you have is the only male in the house is attacked. The women are not, and it's in a home in which there's an Italian grocery. And in this case, the killer gets the axe from the backyard, breaks in through the bedroom window, attacks Joseph Romano, walks out through the house past his Romano's niece's bedroom, out of the house, leaving the axe. So I think this is the kind of evidence that played into the jury thinking, well, there's somebody else out here committing these attacks. It couldn't have been Bessemer.
Okay. Well, we've reached a time where we have to take another station identification break, and we'll continue this when we come back.
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Several U.S. presidents are on record talking about the UFO mystery.
Yeah, Presidents Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan both had UFO sightings of their own, but the current presidential campaign might be the first in which UFO disclosure has been championed by a major party candidate.
DIA, CIA, it moves around, is operating a program to train psychic spies to spy and use their powers against Russia. John Ronson writes about this in The Men Who Stare at Goats.
The first known sighting of a ghost took place right after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the late 1860s during the administration of Ulysses Grant.
Project Paperclip, Clinton releases it all in 1998.
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial.
It's a place where UFO hunters and scientists gather to examine paranormal activity in the region.
Some of the documents, this is bringing Nazi scientists into the United States to work here. So we fought against the Nazis, and it's not, this again is not a revelation. As early as 1947, 1946, we knew some of this, right?
On the paranormal, will we see U.S. President Barack Obama's foreign policy go intergalactic in a quest for gold stolen by aliens? We'll tell you at least how the White House responded to claims the chief executive has been teleporting to Mars. But let's get to today's Capitol account.
UFOs, hauntings, psychic abilities, conspiracy, ESP, cryptozoology. There are many things that remain unexplained in the inexplicable world around us, and we're talking about them here, looking for answers on WBHM Digital Broadcasting, Birmingham, Alabama. The truth is out there.
Thank you for listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. The time is 23 minutes after the hour.
All right, everybody, we are back, and we are talking with Dr. Miriam C. Davis about the New Orleans Axeman murders. I wanted to jump back just a little bit back to the Bessemer case, and it was something that I found that a lot of things that have been written up about the Axeman case, some of them don't make sense. Some of them I think are added just to make the story even weirder than it actually already was. But I had heard in a couple places that Bessemer had actually been accused as being a German spy, just because the World War I was still kind of fresh, and that even Lowe had accused him of that during one of her stories. Had you heard anything about that?
Oh yeah, that's true. This was, I think World War I was still going on, and people were really paranoid about German spies. And he seems to have been, Polish/German. It's not clear which he was. He was probably a Pole who lived within the German Empire, and he probably spoke German. And so during some of this period when she's, not mentally clearly in her right mind, she accuses him of being a German spy and saying, he's got things written in German letters in his strongbox. And the police showed up and took away a bunch of letters that were written, in foreign languages, and what language they were depended on which newspaper account you read. So we don't really know. They might have been Yiddish. He might have been Jewish. And the sort of precursor to the FBI was alerted to this case, but nothing ever came of that.
So it wasn't actually brought up.
I mean, they did investigate this possibility that he was a German spy, and nothing ever came of it, because he certainly was. I think it'd been very weird if he was, because he called a lot of attention to himself. But It is true, there was this accusation.
I was just wondering whether that was another one of those things that somebody had, just kind of concocted.
No, that is true. That actually is true.
So one of the follow-up attacks, listen to me. Another one of the attacks, in my mind, was almost one of the most horrible, was the Mary Schneider, when he attacked her and she was 8 months pregnant. Now, luckily she survived. She managed to give birth, but does it seem like attacking a pregnant woman, did that seem to anger the crowd, the population, more than, say, any of the other cases?
Well, again, I don't think that was an Axeman attack. For one thing, she wasn't actually attacked with an axe. She was hit with a lamp. And again, it's one of those cases that has gotten garbled, that Robert Talent identifies her as an Axeman victim, and I've heard in various podcasts and in true crime accounts that she's identified as an Axeman victim, but she was hit with a lamp. There was the police at the time didn't think it was an Axeman crime. The press, there's some press headlines that tied it to the Axeman, and I think maybe in the public mind it became a certain level associated with the Axeman. But when you read the actual newspaper accounts, none of the police thought this was an Axeman crime. For one thing, there was just no axe involved.
Wow.
Does that answer your question? Because there's another attack on a woman about a year later. And again, when you look at the actual evidence, there's really it doesn't support the charge that it's actually an Axeman attack. The Axeman only attacked Italian grocers. He only attacked couples in their bed in the middle of the night.
Well,
All of the other cases sorry, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that all of the other cases that appear to be exceptions, when I looked into them and got the details, they just did not match the details of the attacks on the Italian grocers.
Well, do you think that they might have been trying to place those two attacks under the same umbrella to try to maybe close out some cases because the Axeman was going on at the time?
Well, the police weren't. I don't think it was the police's fault, because when you read the quotes from interviews with the police, it's pretty clear they did not consider these Axeman crimes. It's the press that was responsible for the mix-up.
Right.
It's the press.
That's, I'm sorry. That was my mistake. Yeah, I meant the press putting those together, probably for readership or something.
Well, and just, how you can get an idea fixed in your head. I mean, there was one journalist named Jim Colton who did believe there was a single killer out there. And I think he had a tendency to any of these attacks, he tended to associate with the Axeman. And again, there was also often a discrepancy between the headline, which would mention the Axeman, and the actual story, which made it clear that it wasn't an Axeman attack. So sometimes I think the person who wrote the headline may well have been different from the person who wrote the story.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, unfortunately, it also seems like a lot of people who put stories or the story of the Axeman murders, especially online, don't bother to do any research themselves into what they're putting up. Because, I tried to go through as many different locations as I could to try and find information. And a lot of them kind of reiterate that, yes, this was an Axeman murder, and I trust you because of the research you did. And it seems like a lot of people are just putting stuff up just to put it up to say that, they wrote a story about the Axeman. So. Well,
again, most of that you'll find is just a recapitulation of Robert Tallent's version. There have only been one or two other. I don't think anybody has done as thorough a job as I have, but there are at least one or two other authors who've done a reasonably responsible job. They weren't going as deep as I did, but they did fairly accurate accounts of the Axeman killings. Right. But a lot of times many people did not do that. They just, as I said, just repeat the same old story again.
Yeah.
Well, 4 days after the attack on the Cortimiglia family, I'm Italian and I can't even say that. I should be shocked. He sent a letter to the newspaper. And in the letter, he talks about being a demon falling from the hottest from the hottest hell and not being a human. He addresses the letter to esteemed mortal. It seems obvious the man was insane. And his actions prove this. Was there ever any attempt to look at doctors' patient lists, et cetera, for someone who could fit this insanity?
Well, first, I don't think the letter was written by the Axeman. And second, I did actually try to get hold of some of the records of people who were designated insane. That might have been Axeman candidates, but I never got anywhere with that. But no, I think there's good reason to believe that whoever wrote the letter had nothing to do with the crimes. As I said before, we have good reason to think that the attacker was working class, who wouldn't have received at that time a very good education. And the person who wrote this letter was well educated. It was very fluidly written. It was very grammatically written. It had this classical allusion to Tartaros, and I, when I consulted with a homicide detective and a profiler, they both thought that no, there's no way that the actual killer wrote this letter. But I do have a theory as to who might have written the letter. You want to hear it?
Yes.
Yes.
I thought you might. Anyway, there's a jazz musician, a jazz songwriter named J.J. Davila, who lived in New Orleans, who about a couple of weeks after the Cornelia attack, a couple of weeks after this letter to the Times-Picayune is published, comes out with a song named The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, or Don't Scare Me, Papa. And he makes a packet off that. And when I was telling the homicide detective about this, he looks at me, he stops and he looks at me and he says, he's the one, he done it. He was convinced that he wrote the letter. And it makes some sense. I think he wrote the letter as a joke to gin up interest in the music that he was about to release. I don't think he meant it to be taken seriously.
Twisted promotion.
I'm sorry?
I said we twisted promotion for his music.
Yeah. That's what I think it was. And I don't, most people, despite what Robert Talent says, most people in New Orleans at the time did not take the letter very seriously. Now, some people used it as an excuse to stay up all night and listen to jazz. Some of the Italians, of course, were scared to death, particularly ones who didn't read, who might not have been very well educated, more superstitious. They were really scared to death, and so it was a really mean thing to do to them. But most people in New Orleans treated it like a joke, and I just think Talent in his account takes it too seriously, and that's why I think subsequent writers have taken it very seriously.
Yeah, because I was going to say, one of the big things with the story nowadays is that letter and the supposed Axeman saying that anybody who has how did the letter state it, a jazz band in full swing will be spared the axe. And I know that's one of the big things now with the story is how everybody played jazz that night and no murder took place. So the Axeman was good to his word.
Well, that's the version that makes it into the American Horror Story, isn't it? Season 3. Yeah. The jazz-loving serial killer. And you can see why. I mean, that makes it, serial killers generally, once you figure them out, they're not that interesting. They tend to be very repetitive. And this letter makes the story more interesting.
Yeah, it definitely does. And so, basically, it was just the Italians that kind of took it seriously and were up playing jazz, or did a lot of the town itself do it, like you said, as an excuse to party?
Well, I think some people took it as an excuse to party. It was a joke. I think the Italians who took it seriously didn't so much stay up playing jazz music as they stayed up with their shotguns. I mean, you have stories.
That would make more sense to me.
I mean, we have accounts at the time of Italian families banding together and, the families trying to sleep during the night and the men staying up with their shotguns. So I don't think they were playing jazz, but I think some of them, the less educated among them might well have been quite frightened.
Well, I know I probably would have been.
Yeah.
But then again, I would have also had my shotgun ready too, so.
Well, a jazz band and a shotgun. I mean, one way or the other, you're covered.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but he doesn't have any bullets for his gun.
That's what I tell you, Pete. Come
on
over.
Yeah, it's more of a Barney Fife kind of. Well, no, that's one bullet. Barney would be better than you.
Well, but if the Axeman was actually supernatural, as the letter claimed, a gun wouldn't have done you any good.
Now, that's true. That is true. So there was never any other than just this one letter. There was never any communication with between the killer, the police, or anybody that anybody knows of.
Yeah, the taunting letters and stuff.
There was a reference that I ran across in one newspaper account to other possible letters, but that's all I ran across. I have no other evidence of it. That's it. You know as much as I do now. That's all. There was just one little fleeting reference to possible other letters or communications. And I have no idea what that means. I never saw a reference like that again.
That's weird.
Was that a reference in like one of the police files or just a newspaper?
It was in one of the newspapers.
Okay, so it could have just been a news reporter's theory then.
Could have been. It could have been something that got garbled. Who knows?
Right. So just out of curiosity, after a few of the attacks, I guess after the Schneider attack, even though that was most likely not an axe murder or Axeman attack, is it true that he just sort of took a break for a while and there was no killings related to him?
Well, what happened is he seems to have taken a break between 1911 and the very end of 1917. And then he was active in New Orleans for about a year and a half. And he disappears from New Orleans. And that's when I trace him to these other attacks elsewhere in Louisiana.
Okay. All right.
So the case that Pete was talking about, the Cortimiglia. Cortimiglia. That seems to be one of the like the first one after he came back from his break, and that wasn't actually in New Orleans, was it? It was across the river. Is that correct?
It's part of Greater New Orleans now. It was at the time in the little separate town of Gretna, right across the river. Yes.
Now, is that like outside of where he would normally strike? Because I'm just trying to figure out, because it seems like it was kind of away from his normal area.
Well, my theory, there was a lot of effort on the part of the New Orleans police to send out additional patrols to protect the neighborhoods where they thought the Axeman might strike next. And my theory is he just moved away from the hot spots into a different jurisdiction.
So it was kind of a way for him to hopefully evade the law.
Well, yeah, because the New Orleans police were looking for him. And he didn't have to go far. He just went across the river, but it was a different jurisdiction, and nobody was looking for the Axeman there.
I bet they started afterwards.
Well, that's another story. Yes and no.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what, we have to take another break, but let's definitely get back into that as soon as we come back on the other side.
Okay.
You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, come on. I'm Southern, but... nope. That'll do. Hello. I am Kat Hobson, host of Paranormal Experience here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting out of Birmingham, Alabama. I enjoy having guests from all areas of the paranormal, from ghosts to ufology to cryptids and beyond. You'll find some of the best researchers in their fields bringing you some great information. Join me on Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 p. Eastern here on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Since 1948, Fate magazine has brought you reports of the strange and unknown, all of them true. Fate Radio is carrying on that tradition, bringing you the unusual, macabre, strange, and bizarre. Join host Kat Hobson Sunday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on WBHM Digital Broadcasting.
Listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experienced Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.
And we're back talking with Dr. Miriam C. Davis. Now, Dr. Davis, you were about to explain to us what happened after the Cortimiglia killing. So can you tell us what was so unusual about that?
Well, Rosie and Charlie Cortimiglia were attacked and badly injured, and their toddler daughter, 2-year-old daughter, Mary, was killed. They're put in Charity Hospital. The New Orleans police are telling the Gretna authorities, "This is our fiend." They didn't have the word serial killer, but this is our fiend. The Gretna police, for whatever reason, decided no, it wasn't whoever was attacking grocers in New Orleans. It was the next door neighbors, the Giordanos, elderly, like 69-year-old Orlando Giordano and his 17-year-old Frank, who must have done it. And so what seems to have happened is while Rosie and Charlie were in Charity Hospital, the police were just haranguing them of, did the Giordanos do it? They must have did it. Didn't they do it? Didn't they do it? Until, and all the time, to anybody else, the Cortimiglias were saying, we don't know who did it. We don't know who did it. Well, all of a sudden, the police start saying, this is the Gretna authorities, start claiming that the Cortimiglias have identified the Giordanos. Now, to nobody else do they make this claim. Not to the doctors, not to the reporters, nobody. Just the police claim to have heard this. When Rosie gets out of the hospital after 3 weeks, she's immediately arrested by the Gretna sheriff and put in jail as a material witness. And she's not released until she agrees to sign an affidavit indicting her neighbors. And they are convicted based on nothing more than her coerced identification. And the 17-year-old Frank is sentenced to be hanged. 9 months later, Rosie Cortimiglia walks into the Times-Picayune's office and says, St. Joseph came to me in a dream and told me I had to tell the truth. I lied. They didn't do it. And eventually, this leads to the Giordanos being released. So the Gretna authorities did not start looking for the Axeman because they decided that these next door neighbors, also Italian grocers, that they had to have done it, and they basically framed them.
So I wonder if that had more to do with them not wanting to admit that the Axeman had come into their jurisdiction, or whether they just didn't want to be bothered looking for him. That just seems like some judicial malpractice there.
Well, it was, but I think there's another explanation for it. I think, first of all, people at the time weren't used to the idea of a serial killer. Yes, everybody's heard of Jack the Ripper, but still, the term serial killer doesn't exist until the 1970s. A lot of policemen don't even believe until maybe the 1940s or 1950s there's such a thing as a serial killer. So they weren't, this idea wasn't as obvious to them as it might be to you or me. The second thing is they were familiar with the idea of the Italian vendetta. It was not uncommon for first-generation Italians, for them to take, what we might call extra-legal methods of solving their own problem. And it wasn't uncommon in the Italian community for there to be a dead body and everybody around them saying, I didn't see nothing. So they did frame the Giordanos. They did. However, I think they did it because they didn't believe in serial killers, but they did believe in or think they understood the Italian vendetta. And that to them was the most obvious way of explaining this attack.
Have you ever, well, let me say this. Wait, first let me stop and think. Have you
don't hurt
researched
yourself.
To who? It's hurting a little bit, but I'll get it out, I swear. Have you researched to whom this might have been, or is there research, or did they arrest anybody to who the Axeman was? Or did they have anybody that they think?
The police had some suspects. The thing is, by 1918, they did have fingerprint evidence, and they could check suspects against fingerprints that they found. And nobody that they ever arrested ever, was identified by the Court of Miglias or anybody else. Apparently none of the fingerprints matched. There was, so I would say no, nobody knows who the Axeman really was. Now, there was a person named Joseph Mumfree who is most often suggested. Yes. Talent suggested him as a possible Axeman suspect. He is the most frequently suggested person who might have been responsible for the Axeman killings. And the one thing my book was absolutely able to prove conclusively is that he could not have possibly been the Axeman.
Why is that?
I got hold of his prison records, and he was in Angola Farm for most of the attacks.
Now, did the police seriously look at him as like a prime suspect?
No. What happened was, there's a man named Mike Pepitone, who Talent said was the last Axeman victim, but I don't think he was an Axeman victim at all. I think he was a victim of the Italian vendetta. Okay. His widow, Esther, moves to Los Angeles, where she marries a man named Angelo Albano, who was a former partner of Joseph Mumfree. When Joseph Mumfree gets out of prison, he goes out to L.A. And his old partner, Angelina Albano, goes missing. And according to Esther Albano, Joseph Mumfree shows up at her house demanding money and says, if you don't give it to me, I'll do to you what I did to your husband, meaning the now missing Angelo Albano. Esther goes into her bedroom as if she's going to get cash, comes out with a loaded revolver, empties the revolver into Mumfree, goes back, reloads, empties another revolver into Mumfree, pleads self-defense, and is acquitted by a Californian jury. But in the account that got back to New Orleans, what got back to New Orleans was that Esther said that Mumfree said, I'll do to you what I did to your husband. And it was interpreted in New Orleans as that referring to Mike Pepitone, not Angelo Albano. And Mike Pepitone was kind of associated again in the public mind with being an Axeman victim. Although, again, if you read the accounts, it's pretty clear the police didn't believe he was an Axeman victim. That's how you got this theory. Just because the press, again, botched the whole, garbled the whole story. That's how you got this theory that Joseph Mumfree was the Axeman.
Wow.
Seems like the press has been doing it to us for years then.
Well, but look, the press, what happens is the Los Angeles police contacted New Orleans police to get Joseph Mumfree's criminal history. So the New Orleans press hears about this from the New Orleans police, who've heard about it from the LA police, who've heard about it from the account they're getting from Esther, right? So this is like the telephone game. And so by the time and so by the time the press get hold of it, it's completely garbled. And there is an account that appears in the New Orleans paper, I think in maybe 1920, that basically sets the stage for what Robert Talent will later say. And it's just wrong in a lot of particulars. But that's how sort of this wrong version of the Axeman story, I think, got started. It's just the press garbling what actually happened.
So sort of a case of one person telling another person who then tells another person, but it grows and it just keeps growing with each telling.
Yeah, that's what I think had happened, basically.
Yeah, I can see that definitely. Just really quick, I was kind of curious about something. You had said that with the letter and the whole "if you play jazz," that a lot of the people in New Orleans were not taking it all that seriously, taking it more as a joke. Now, when the Axeman sort of took a break, did the people of New Orleans even notice? And when it became known that he had struck again and may come back, again, what was their reaction? Were they like all of a sudden? I would imagine the Italians were, back in kind of a panic mode. But what was the mood in New Orleans like at that particular time when they kind of realized, oh my God, he's back?
Well, it didn't quite happen like that. The break was between the Cleaver attacks, which ended in 1911, and the Axeman attacks, which began at the very end of 1917. And this was a big break of about 6 years. And when the second series of attacks started up again, it's not even clear who connected them to the attacks 6 years earlier. During the course of, 18 months, the height of the Axeman, hysteria, there's not really a break. You might have several months that go between attacks, but there's not really, I think, what you can clearly identify as a break. But you did have this period around the time of the Romano killing and the Cortimiglia killing, end of 1918, beginning of 1919, that I think I would identify as the real height of the Axeman hysteria. That's when, people are sitting up all night with shotguns.
Gotcha.
I'm not sure that answers your question or not.
Oh, no, it definitely does. It's a case, I guess, of the story being a little different depending on which version you read, especially since, most of the research was done online. And a lot of the stories say that after one of the killings, during the main stretch between 18 and 19, that he took a bit of a break in between and then came back with the Cortimiglia killings. So, I think I was a little confused on, where the break was depending on which story I was reading.
Yeah. And I mean, it depends on what you define as a break, because between the Romano killing and the Cortimiglia killing, there were several months. I just tend to lump them into two sets, the 1910 and 1911, and then the 1917 to 1919 set. But I mean, clearly, the 1918, 1919, there were the most number of fatalities. That was when people were really, really frightened.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're running out of time here. I just wanted to ask, what is next for you? What's in your future? Are you going to be writing any more true crime? What are your plans?
Well, right now I'm ghostwriting something for somebody else. But after I finish that, I will. I'm sorry.
I'm messing with you.
Oh,
I said, sorry. I said, you see, you do know something about paranormal.
That's as close as I'm going to come to a ghost. But I don't know. I'm thinking about what I might do with my next big project, my own work. Well, we'll see. Something will occur to me.
Well, I know.
Something always pleases me.
I know I'm going to be looking forward to it. I actually have your X-Men book on order, and I am waiting with bated breath to get my hands on it. Believe me.
Yeah, I ordered
I
it yesterday myself.
Oh, I know I'm going to enjoy it, especially now after talking to you. This was fantastic. I literally I enjoyed this immensely. Thank you so much for being on.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And hopefully we can have you back on, because I don't even think we've touched the surface of this. Okay. So next Thursday, we will be joined by author and paranormal investigator Mitchell Whittington. We kind of had our times messed up. It will be 8 Eastern, 7 Central, 5 Western time, Pacific time. So I hope you can join us next week. And until then, have yourself a safe weekend, and be safe, everybody. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank
You're listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama. You are listening to WBHM Digital Broadcasting, the best in paranormal talk, only on Paranormal Experience Radio, broadcasting live out of Birmingham, Alabama.